I still remember the exact moment everything shifted. The second my 7-year-old son leaned close and whispered, "Mom, Dad doesn't know I saw her." His voice was so quiet it barely reached me, slipping between the soft clink of silverware and the low hum of polite conversation. For a second, I thought I imagined it, but then I felt his small hand tighten around my sleeve, and something cold moved through my chest. I didn't look at him right away. I couldn't, because across the table, my husband was smiling. Jared leaned back in his chair, relaxed, confident, pouring Brianna another glass of red wine like he had done it 100 times before, like she belonged here. "What did you see?" I asked under my breath, keeping my tone light, my face calm, my eyes still fixed on my plate. Patrick hesitated, then leaned even closer. "She put something in Dad's jacket," he whispered, when no one was looking. And just like that, everything inside me went still. Not panic, not confusion, recognition. I had spent years building a career around reading people, understanding patterns, spotting the one detail everyone else missed. And this felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain yet. I smiled. I nodded at something Brianna said. I even laughed once, softly, at a joke that wasn't funny. Then I stood up. "I'm going to take Patrick to wash his hands," I said casually. Jared didn't even look at me. "Sure," he replied, already turning back toward Brianna. Of course he didn't. That was the first real confirmation. I took my son's hand and walked out of the dining room, my steps steady, measured, unhurried. The moment we crossed into the hallway, the noise behind us dulled. Like someone had closed a door on the world I thought I understood. "Stay right here," I told Patrick gently. He nodded, trusting me the way only a child can. The hallway felt colder than it should have. Quieter. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. Jared's jacket hung exactly where it always did, on the polished wooden rack near the front door. Nothing about it looked out of place. That was the problem. I stood there for a second, just looking at it, letting my breathing settle. If Patrick was right, and I knew he was, then whatever I was about to find wasn't an accident. People don't slip things into someone's pocket unless they want them to be found. Slowly, I reached out. My fingers brushed the fabric first. Smooth, familiar, ordinary. Then I slid my hand into the pocket. The weight hit me before my mind could catch up. It was heavier than it should have been. My fingers closed around something solid, cold. I pulled it out just enough to see the edge, a glimpse of something expensive, unmistakably not Jared's, something that didn't belong in his life, let alone in his coat. My stomach dropped. But I didn't stop. I reached back in. This time, my fingers brushed against something smaller, softer, a sealed edge. My hand froze for half a second before I forced myself to pull it out. I didn't need to fully look. I already knew. The kind of item that doesn't end up in a pocket by mistake. The kind of item that, if found, changes everything. For a moment, the world around me disappeared. No voices, no light, just the quiet, suffocating realization settling into place. This wasn't about dinner. This wasn't about a contract. This wasn't even about humiliation. This was a setup, a calculated, deliberate, carefully timed setup. I exhaled slowly, forcing my heartbeat back under control. Panic would have been the natural response. Fear, even more so. But neither of those would help me now. I slid the items back into the pocket exactly as I had found them, adjusting the fabric with careful precision. No wrinkles, no signs of disturbance, no evidence that anyone had touched it. Then I stepped back. From the dining room, I could still hear them. Jared's voice, easy and confident. Brianna's laughter, just a little too comfortable. For a second, I closed my eyes. The past few weeks flashed through my mind in fragments. The late nights, the vague explanations, the subtle way Jared had started dismissing my opinions, as if I no longer belonged in decisions that affected both of us. And Brianna, Always just a little too present. A little too involved. A little too sure of her place. I had noticed it. I just hadn't understood it. Until now. I opened my eyes and looked back toward the dining room. This wasn't something that had just happened. This had been planned. Every word, every moment, every detail of this night had been leading here. They weren't waiting for me to sign anything. They were waiting for something else. Something much worse. I turned back to Patrick and took his hand again, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You did good," I said softly. He looked up at me, searching my face. "Are we okay?" I smiled at him. Real this time. "We're more than okay." And for the first time that night, I meant it. Because I understood something now that they didn't. They thought I had just walked away to breathe. They thought I was still sitting at that table. Confused? Pressured. Trying to keep the peace. They thought I was about to fall right into whatever they had planned. But I wasn't. I had already seen it. And once you see the game for what it is, you stop being the one who loses. This wasn't the first time something felt wrong. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, my hand still resting lightly against the edge of Jared's coat, as if touching it might give me answers it had already given. But the truth didn't come from the fabric or the weight in the pocket. It came from memory. A few weeks earlier, I had started noticing the smallest things. Not dramatic changes. Not anything I could point to and say, "This is it." Just shifts. Jared had always been busy. That wasn't new. But busy used to mean predictable. Scheduled. Transparent? Lately, it had become vague. Late-night calls he would take outside. Conversations that ended the moment I walked into the room. His phone, once carelessly left on the kitchen counter, now always within reach, always face down. "Work's been intense," he said the first time I asked. I believed him. The second time, I told myself not to overthink it. By the third, I stopped asking. Not because I wasn't curious, because I was paying attention. Then there was the money. I didn't obsess over our finances, but I understood them. It's part of what I do, seeing patterns. Reading between numbers. Noticing when something doesn't add up. Small inconsistencies at first. Transfers that didn't quite match the explanation. Delays that didn't fit Jared's usual efficiency. He brushed them off easily. "It's just timing," he told me. Different accounts. Different processing. It sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. Looking back, that should have been my first real warning. When something sounds perfectly logical, it often means someone took the time to make it sound that way. And then Brianna entered the picture. The first time I met her, it was casual. Jared mentioned her over dinner, almost as an afterthought. "She's a business contact," he said. "Smart. Ambitious. You'll like her." I remember the way he said it, too neutral. Too carefully neutral. When she finally came over, she didn't act like a guest. She walked into my home like she already knew where everything was. Like she had been there before. Maybe not physically, but in conversation. In familiarity. "Melissa," she said with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've heard so much about you." I smiled back. "I'm sure you have." At the time, it felt like a normal exchange. Now, I could hear the tension hidden beneath it. What stood out most wasn't what she said. It was how she interacted with Jared. She finished his sentences. Not occasionally. Not by accident, like it was something they had practiced. Shared glances. Private jokes that hung in the air just long enough for me to notice I wasn't part of them. I didn't confront it. I observed, because confrontation gives people time to adjust their story. Observation lets the truth unfold. Back in the dining room, the pattern was impossible to ignore now. I walked in with Patrick beside me, my face composed, my movements steady. No one looked up right away. They were too absorbed in their own rhythm. Jared was leaning slightly toward Brianna, his elbow resting near her glass, his voice low but animated. "It's about scaling the structure," he was saying. "You can't think small with these things." Brianna nodded. her eyes flicking toward me just for a second before returning to him. Exactly, she said. That's what I've been telling you. Telling you. Not suggesting. Not discussing. Telling. I sat back down, smoothing my napkin across my lap, letting the conversation wash over me without reacting. You see what I mean? Jared said, finally glancing at me. It's a different level of thinking. I met his gaze. Calm and unreadable. I see that you've been thinking about it, I replied. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't disagreement. It was a statement. And for a brief second, something in his expression tightened. Brianna filled the silence quickly. It's not just thinking, she said lightly. It's understanding how bigger deals work. Not everyone is used to that kind of scale. There it was. Subtle. Polished. Dismissive. I tilted my head slightly, as if considering her words. You're right, I said. Not everyone is... Jared chuckled. Like the tension hadn't just shifted. That's why we're trying to get on the same page, he added. The word landed heavier than it should have. Because it didn't include me. The room felt smaller suddenly. Or maybe I just saw it more clearly. The angles of their bodies. The direction of their attention. The quiet alignment that had been forming for weeks. Now sitting right in front of me. Undeniable. This wasn't a conversation I had walked into. It was one that had been happening long before I realized it existed. And tonight wasn't about including me. It was about managing me. I picked up my glass, taking a small sip, giving myself a moment to think without appearing to think. Everything that had felt slightly off before now connected. The calls, the money, the way Jared had started positioning himself differently in our conversations, the way Brianna spoke, not like an outsider, but like someone who had already been invited in. This dinner wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't even social. It was planned. Every word, every topic, every glance had a purpose. I set my glass down carefully, my fingers steady against the stem. Across from me, Jared checked his phone for just a second too long before slipping it back into his pocket. Waiting. That's what it was. Not pressure. Not persuasion. Timing. They weren't trying to convince me of anything. They were waiting for something to happen. And whatever it was, it hadn't happened yet. I walked back into the dining room like nothing had changed. But everything had. The lighting was still warm. The table still perfectly set. The wine still catching the soft glow from the chandelier above. On the surface, it looked like the same quiet, upscale dinner we had started less than an hour ago. But now I could see the cracks. Jared looked up briefly as I returned, offering a quick smile before turning back to Brianna. It wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was dismissive, like I had already been accounted for. I took my seat, smoothing my napkin across my lap, my movements slow and controlled. Patrick stayed close to me, his small shoulder brushing mine before he settled into his chair again. Unusually quiet. I didn't speak right away. I watched. Jared leaned slightly toward Brianna, his tone relaxed. Confident. You can't think about it the way most people do, he was saying. At a certain level. It's about leverage, not effort. Brianna nodded, her expression thoughtful but assured. Exactly, she said. It's about positioning yourself before the opportunity even exists. Then she glanced at me. Just for a second. Not everyone is comfortable with that kind of strategy. There it was again. Subtle. Controlled. Designed to land without looking like it was meant to. I tilted my head slightly, as if considering her words. No, I said calmly. Not everyone is. Jared let out a small laugh. The kind that smooths over tension without actually addressing it. That's what I've been trying to explain, he added. There's a difference between understanding business and thinking at scale. His eyes met mine briefly, then moved away just as quickly. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger. Clarity. Because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was positioning. They weren't talking to me. They were talking around me. I picked up my fork, cutting into my food with careful precision, even though I wasn't hungry. The rhythm of the motion gave me something to anchor to, something steady in a room that was shifting beneath the surface. "So what exactly are you working on together?" I asked, my tone neutral. Jared leaned back slightly, as if the question had been expected. "It's still early," he said, "but there's potential. Big potential." Brianna smiled. "It's the kind of opportunity that requires alignment," she added. "You can't move forward if everyone isn't on the same page." Alignment. The word hung in the air. I set my fork down. "And are we on the same page?" I asked. Jared hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then he reached beside him and picked something up from the edge of the table. A document. Thick. Formal. Already prepared. He placed it in front of me with a casual ease that felt anything but casual. "We can be," he said. I looked down at it. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. A post-nuptial agreement. The kind of document you don't introduce over dinner unless you've already decided how the conversation is supposed to end. "You've had time to think about it," Jared continued. "This just formalizes things. Protects both of us. Both of us." I let out a quiet breath, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper. "And her?" I asked, glancing briefly at Brianna. Brianna didn't flinch. "If we're going to be working together," she said smoothly, "everything needs to be structured properly. It's standard. Standard." The word almost made me smile. Because nothing about this was standard. Not the timing. Not the setting. Not the way the two of them sat there. Perfectly aligned, waiting for me to respond. Jared slid a pen toward me. "You don't need to overthink it," he said. "It's straightforward." I looked at the pen, then at him, then back at the document. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Patrick seemed to sense it, his small hands resting still against the edge of the table. "Just sign it," Jared added, his tone firmer now. "We can move forward." Brianna leaned slightly forward, her voice softer, almost reassuring. "If there's nothing to worry about, there's nothing to hesitate over." There it was. The pressure, wrapped in logic, delivered like reason. I let the silence stretch. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, intentional, because they expected a reaction. Confusion, resistance, emotion, something they could respond to, something they could use. But I didn't give them anything. I placed my hand over the document, not to pull it closer, not to sign it, just to steady it against the table. "I don't sign anything I haven't reviewed properly," I said. My voice was calm, even unshaken. Jared's expression tightened. "It's not complicated." "Melissa, that doesn't mean I sign it over dinner," I replied. Brianna's smile flickered for just a second, then returned. "Sometimes timing matters," she said lightly. "Opportunities don't wait." I met her gaze. "Then it's a good thing I don't rush decisions," I said. For a moment, the room held still. Jared's fingers tapped once against the table before he leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "This doesn't have to be difficult," he said. But it already was. Not because of the document, because of what it represented. I looked at both of them, really looked this time. The way they sat, the way they watched me, the way they waited. And suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't about getting me to agree. This wasn't about convincing me. They weren't trying to change my mind. They were buying time, waiting for something else to happen. I shifted slightly in my seat, my eyes flicking briefly toward the hallway where Jared's jacket still hung. Then back to the table, back to them. They were so sure of how this night would end, so certain of the outcome. And for the first time since this dinner began, I understood why. Because whatever they were planning had already been set in motion. Patrick's hand brushed against mine again, softer this time, but more urgent. I felt it before I looked at him. The tension, the kind that doesn't come from a child not understanding what's happening, but from one who understands too much. I turned slightly, keeping my movements small, careful not to draw attention. Across the table, Jared was still talking, his voice steady, confident, like nothing in the world was out of place. Brianna sat beside him, listening, nodding at the right moments. Her posture relaxed in a way that now felt deliberate. Too deliberate. I lowered my gaze to Patrick. He wasn't eating. His fork rested untouched beside his plate. His eyes flicked once toward the hallway, then back to me. That was all I needed. I placed my hand gently over his, grounding him, and leaned just enough for my voice to stay between us. "What is it?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly against mine. Then he leaned closer, his voice barely a breath. "I saw her," he whispered. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. "What did you see?" I asked, my tone steady, as if we were talking about something ordinary. He swallowed. "She went to the coats," he said. "When you were in the kitchen before." I kept my face neutral, my expression soft, my posture unchanged. "And," Patrick glanced up quickly, then back down. "She put something in Dad's jacket," he whispered. But he didn't see. The words settled into place with a kind of quiet finality. Not surprise. Confirmation. I didn't react. Not outwardly. I picked up my glass. Took a small sip. Let the movement anchor me in something normal. Across the table, Brianna laughed at something Jared said. It was light. Controlled. Perfectly timed. Like everything else about her. I set the glass down slowly. "Are you sure?" I asked Patrick. My voice still low. Still calm. He nodded immediately. "I saw it," he said. "She looked around first. Careful. Intentional. That single detail told me everything." I gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "You did the right thing telling me," I said softly. He looked up at me, searching my face. "Are we in trouble?" he asked. I shook my head, a small, reassuring smile forming before I could think about it. "No," I said. "We're not," and in that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to react. I wasn't going to confront them at the table, not while they still believed everything was unfolding exactly the way they planned. I needed to see it. Confirm it. Understand it fully. "I'm going to take him to wash his hands," I said, lifting my gaze toward Jared. He barely glanced at me. "Yeah, sure," he said, distracted, already turning back toward Brianna. "Of course." I stood up, taking Patrick's hand. My movement smooth, unhurried. No one stopped me. No one questioned it. Why would they? From their perspective, everything was still under control. We walked out of the dining room together, the sound of their conversation fading as we stepped into the hallway. The shift was immediate. The warmth disappeared. The noise disappeared. All that remained was the quiet. Patrick stayed close to me, his small hand still wrapped tightly around mine. "Stay right here," I told him gently, stopping just short of the coat rack. He nodded, trusting, but his eyes stayed fixed on me. I turned slowly. Jared's jacket hung exactly where it always did, draped neatly over the wooden hook near the door. It looked ordinary, harmless. That was the illusion. I took a step closer, then another. Each movement deliberate, measured, controlled. Behind me, the faint sound of laughter drifted from the dining room. Brianna's voice. Jared's response. They were relaxed, comfortable, certain. I stopped in front of the coat rack, my eyes settling on the jacket. For a moment, I didn't move. I let the silence settle around me. Let my breathing even out. Let my thoughts align. People don't hide things unless they want them to be found. And people don't plant things unless they're waiting for something to happen next. I could feel Patrick watching me, waiting for some sign that everything was okay. I didn't look back at him. Not yet. Because whatever I was about to find would confirm everything. I reached out slowly, my fingers hovering just above the fabric for a fraction of a second before making contact. The material was smooth beneath my hand. Familiar. Safe. Except it wasn't. I slid my hand into the pocket, and just before my fingers closed around what was inside, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a setup, and whatever came next was already in motion. My fingers closed around something cold. For a second, I didn't move. I just held it there, inside the pocket, letting the weight of it settle into my palm. It was heavier than it should have been, solid in a way that didn't belong to anything Jared owned. Slowly, I pulled it out just enough to see it. A watch. Not Jared's. I knew every piece he wore, every detail he cared about. This wasn't one of them. The metal caught the dim hallway light. Polished, expensive, unmistakably out of place. My stomach tightened. But I didn't stop. I slid my hand back into the pocket. This time, my fingers brushed against something softer. A small, sealed edge. The texture alone told me what it was before I even pulled it out. I hesitated for half a second. Then I took it. A small plastic bag, neatly sealed. The contents inside unmistakable. I didn't need to stare at it. I didn't need to question it. I had seen enough cases, enough patterns, enough lives fall apart over something exactly like this. The hallway seemed to shrink around me, the air tightening, pressing in from all sides. Somewhere behind me, laughter drifted faintly from the dining room. Light, careless, untouched by what I was holding in my hands. That contrast told me everything. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Carefully chosen items. Carefully placed. Carefully timed. I exhaled slowly, forcing my breathing to stay even. Think. That was the only thing that mattered now. Not react. Not panic. Not confront. Think. The pieces aligned faster than I expected. They always did when I stopped letting emotion get in the way. They plant the items. They call it in. The police arrive. The search begins. The items are found. Not on Jared. Not on Brianna. On the... Or worse, on Patrick. The thought hit harder than anything else. My jaw tightened. But my hands stayed steady. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about control. It was about removing me completely. Criminal charges. Loss of credibility. Loss of custody. A clean, irreversible break. And once I was out of the way, everything else would follow. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the reality settle fully into place. Then I opened them, and the fear was gone. Not because the situation wasn't dangerous, but because I understood it, and once you understand something like this, you can use it. I looked down at the items again. The watch. The bag. Evidence. That's all they were. And evidence only matters depending on where it's found. My mind shifted. Fast and precise. What did I have? Time. A small window. Opportunity. I glanced around the hallway, my eyes scanning the space with new clarity. The coat rack. The entryway. The angle from the dining room. No direct line of sight. Good. Then my gaze moved slightly to the side and stopped. Brianna's bag, sitting on the console table near the wall, half unzipped, carelessly placed, like she hadn't even considered it could matter. That was her first mistake. I studied it for a second, mapping the distance, the movement it would take, the sound it might make. Everything slowed again. Not in panic, in focus. Behind me, I could feel Patrick's presence, quiet and still. He hadn't said anything. He didn't need to. I crouched slightly, turning just enough to meet his eyes. Stay right here, I said softly. He nodded immediately. I'm not going anywhere, he whispered. Good. I straightened again, the item still in my hand, my fingers adjusting their grip just enough to keep them hidden. No hesitation, no second guessing, because there wasn't another option. If I did nothing, I lost everything. I stepped forward, one step, then another, each movement controlled, deliberate, silent. The hallway held its breath with me. When I reached the table, I didn't rush. I didn't glance back. I didn't check for reactions. I simply moved. My hand slipped toward the opening of Brianna's bag. A slight shift of fabric. A quiet slide. The weight left my hand. Gone. Just like that. I adjusted the edge of the bag slightly. Not enough to look deliberate. Just enough to settle it back into place. No sound. No disruption. No trace. For a moment, I stood there, completely still. Then I stepped back. The entire action had taken seconds, but everything had changed. I turned and walked back to Patrick, taking his hand again, grounding myself in something real. He looked up at me, searching. I gave him a small nod. We were okay. Better than okay. Because now, the game had shifted. I walked back toward the dining room. My posture relaxed. My expression neutral. My breathing steady. From the outside, nothing had changed. The conversation was still going. Jared was still talking. Brianna was still smiling. They were still waiting. Waiting for their plan to unfold. Waiting for the moment everything would collapse around me. I stepped back into the room and took my seat, folding my hands neatly in front of me. Jared glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable for a fraction of a second before settling back into its usual calm. "Everything okay?" he asked. I met his gaze. "Perfect," I said. And I meant it. Because they thought they were in control. They thought they had already won. But the truth was, they had just lost. They just didn't know it yet. I sat back down like nothing had happened. My chair made the same quiet sound against the floor. My hands rested in the same place. My breathing stayed even. Controlled. Measured. If anyone had been watching closely, they would have seen nothing different. And that was exactly the point. Jared glanced at me for a moment, just long enough to check that I had returned, then turned back to Brianna. His attention shifted away as easily as it always had lately, like I had already been accounted for. "Like I was saying," he continued, picking up the thread of his conversation. "Timing is everything. You either move when the opportunity is there, or you miss it." Brianna smiled, lifting her glass slightly. "And sometimes," she added, "you have to create the opportunity yourself." I almost smiled, because that was exactly what I had just done. I reached for my glass, taking a slow sip, letting the familiar motion ground me. Across from me, Patrick sat quietly, his eyes flicking between me and the table. Still trying to understand what was happening without asking questions he didn't have the words for. I gave him a small, reassuring look. We were fine. Better than fine. The conversation continued around me. But I wasn't really listening anymore. Not to the words. Anyway, I was watching. Jared checked his phone again. Quickly. Subtly. But not subtly enough. There it was. The timing. He wasn't just talking about opportunity. He was waiting for it. Brianna leaned slightly closer to him. Her posture relaxed. Confident. Like she had already stepped into a role that wasn't hers. "How long do you think it will take?" she asked quietly. Jared's response was just as low. Just as controlled. "Not long." That was all he said. But it was enough. I set my glass down carefully. My fingers steady against the stem. They weren't guessing. They weren't hoping. They knew exactly what was coming. And now, so did I. The room felt different to me now. Not threatening. Predictable. Every movement, every glance, every word they exchanged fit into a pattern I could finally see clearly. The illusion was gone. All that remained was structure. And once you understand the structure, you can break it. I shifted slightly in my chair, adjusting my posture, making myself comfortable, waiting. That was all that was left to do. The seconds stretched, slow and quiet, the kind of silence that hides beneath conversation. Jared kept talking. Brianna kept responding. But there was an edge beneath it now, a tension that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it. Patrick's hand moved slightly closer to mine on the table, his small fingers brushing against my wrist. I covered them gently, grounding him without drawing attention. "It's okay," I whispered under my breath. He nodded, trusting me without question. That trust settled something inside me. Because whatever happened next, I wasn't going to let it touch him. Across the table, Brianna reached for her bag briefly, her fingers brushing the edge of it before pulling back. The movement was small, almost absent-minded. But I saw it, and I saw the way her expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second, before returning to its usual calm. She didn't know. Of course she didn't. Why would she check? In her mind, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Jared leaned back slightly, exhaling as if the evening was finally settling into place. "See?" he said, glancing at me again. "No need to overcomplicate things." I met his gaze, holding it for just a second longer than necessary. "Simple is usually best," I replied. He smiled, satisfied. That was the dangerous part. Not the plan. The confidence. Because confidence makes people careless. And careless people make mistakes. The room fell into another brief lull. The kind that happens naturally in conversation. No one rushed to fill it. No one needed to. We were all waiting. Only now, we were waiting for very different things. Jared tapped his fingers lightly against the table, his eyes drifting once more toward his phone. Brianna adjusted her posture, crossing one leg over the other, her movements smooth, controlled, practiced. Patrick stayed close, quiet, watching, and me. I sat perfectly still, because for the first time that night, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't trying to understand. I wasn't trying to keep the peace. I already knew how this ended. All that was left was the moment it would begin. And then, a sound. Sharp. Sudden. Cutting through the room like it didn't belong there. A knock. Firm. Clear. Unmistakable. For a split second, no one moved. Jared's hand froze mid-motion. Brianna's eyes flicked toward the door. Patrick looked up. And I felt it. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Confirmation. Right on time. Jared recovered quickly, pushing his chair back with controlled ease as he stood. "I'll get it," he said, his tone calm. Almost casual. Almost. He smoothed his shirt as he walked toward the hallway, his steps steady, his posture composed. But I saw it. That half-second delay. That brief moment where control slipped, just enough to show what was underneath. Expectation. The door opened, and everything changed. The door opened, and the knight stepped inside. I couldn't see them at first from where I sat, but I heard the shift immediately, the tone of Jared's voice. Polite and controlled, sliding into something more careful. "Can I help you?" he asked. A pause, then a different voice. Firm. Professional. "We received a report. We'd like to ask you a few questions." The air in the room changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was immediate. Like something invisible had just settled over everything, tightening the space between us. Patrick's hand pressed lightly against mine. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I already knew what this was. Jared stepped back into view a second later, 2 uniformed officers behind him. Their presence filled the room in a way no one else had all evening. Calm. Neutral. Unavoidable. "Officers," Jared said with a small, controlled smile. "Is everything okay?" "That depends." One of them replied. "We got an anonymous tip regarding possible illegal possession and stolen property at this address." Anonymous tip. Of course. Jared's expression shifted just enough to suggest surprise. "Stolen property," he repeated. There must be some kind of mistake. His tone was perfect. Measured. Cooperative. Just concerned enough to feel believable. But I saw it now. The precision. The timing. He stepped slightly to the side, opening the space, inviting them further in. "Please." "Come in," he said. "We have nothing to hide." Brianna straightened in her seat as the officers entered. Her movement smooth but just a fraction too quick. Her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the table before she released it, forcing her posture back into place. "Is there a problem?" she asked lightly. The officer closest to her didn't answer right away. His eyes moved around the room, taking everything in, the table, the plates, the people. "Routine, but thorough. We're going to need to take a look around," he said finally. "Of course," Jared replied. "Whatever you need." Then, almost casually, he glanced toward me. "We were just having dinner," he added. "My wife, Melissa." The word landed differently now. Not a title. A position. One he was already preparing to remove. The officer nodded in my direction. "Ma'am," he said. "We'll be as quick as possible." I returned the nod. Calm. Composed. "Take your time," I said. No hesitation. No defensiveness. That caught his attention. Just for a second. Jared moved closer to the officers, lowering his voice slightly. But not enough that I couldn't hear. "If there's been some kind of misunderstanding," he said carefully, "I'd like to help clear it up." Helpful. Cooperative. Positioning. The officer gave a small, neutral nod. "We appreciate that," he said. "We'll need to check personal belongings as well." There it was. The moment they had been waiting for. Jared's eyes flicked toward me again. Quick, almost invisible, but full of something he couldn't quite hide. Expectation. Across the table, Brianna picked up her glass, her hand steady, her expression composed. Too composed. They thought this was already over. I shifted slightly in my seat, placing my hand over Patrick's. "It's okay," I murmured quietly. He nodded, but his grip tightened. The officer stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me directly now. "We're going to start here, if that's all right." "Of course," I replied. Jared didn't say anything, but I felt his attention sharpen. This was it. The beginning of the end. The officer moved methodically, his hands precise. Professional. He reached for my bag, unzipping it carefully, his movement slow enough to stretch the tension in the room. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Brianna's breathing seemed to quiet. He looked through everything, one item at a time, deliberate, unhurried. And then, nothing. He closed the bag. "Thank you," he said. Stepping back slightly. A pause. A small one, but long enough. Jared's expression flickered. Just for a second. Confusion. Then it was gone. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice still smooth, still controlled. "We're going to continue the search," the officer replied. Of course they were. They had to, because they didn't know what I knew. The second officer moved now, his attention shifting across the room, scanning for the next step. And that's when I saw it. Brianna's eyes. Just for a fraction of a second. They dropped. Toward her bag. Then back up again. Her expression resetting almost instantly. But it was enough. The officer followed the movement. "Ma'am," he said, turning toward her. "We'll need to check your belongings as well." Brianna's smile held, but it tightened at the edges. "That's really not necessary," she said lightly. "I just got here. We need to be thorough," he replied. Her fingers curled slightly against the table before she pushed her chair back, standing with controlled grace. "Of course," she said, but her voice wasn't as steady now. "Not quite." Jared stepped forward slightly. "That won't be necessary," he began. "I'm sure—" "It will," the officer said, cutting him off calmly. And just like that, the control shifted. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Enough for the first crack to appear. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hand still resting over Patrick's, my expression calm, unreadable, because I could see it now. The exact moment their plan started to fall apart, and they didn't even realize it yet. The officer reached for Brianna's bag. For a moment, no one breathed. It was a small movement. Routine. Ordinary. But in that second, it carried the weight of everything that had been set in motion long before tonight. Brianna's hand moved instinctively. Just a fraction too fast. That's really not necessary, she said. Her voice light, but tighter now. I told you. I just got here. The officer didn't stop. We need to check all personal belongings, he replied evenly. Jared stepped forward. Look, this is getting a little out of hand, he said, his tone shifting from cooperative to controlled frustration. There's no reason to... There is, the officer interrupted calmly. And that was the moment the balance shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Brianna forced a smile, stepping back slightly to give the officer space. Her posture stayed upright, composed, but I could see it now, the tension in her shoulders, the slight rigidity in her movements. She wasn't expecting this part. None of them were... The officer unzipped the bag slowly. The sound cut through the room. Soft. Precise. Unavoidable. Time stretched. I watched his hands as they moved inside. Methodical. Careful. Trained to notice what others might miss. Jared's attention locked onto the bag. Brianna's fingers curled against her side. Patrick's hand tightened under mine. And I stayed still. Because I already knew what he was going to find. The officer paused. Just for a second. Then he pulled something out. The watch. It caught the light as it came into view. Polished. Unmistakable. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Like the air itself had been pulled out. The officer's expression didn't change. But his posture did. Slightly more alert. Slightly more focused. Can you explain this? He asked. Brianna blinked. Once. Then again. I don't know how that got there, she said quickly. That's not mine. Her voice was still controlled. But the edges were fraying. The officer didn't respond. He reached back into the bag. Jared shifted beside her. Hold on, he said. There's obviously been a mistake. The second item came out. Small. Sealed. Unmistakable. And just like that, everything broke. Brianna's composure shattered first. That's not mine, she said again. Louder now. I didn't put that there. Her eyes moved rapidly. Searching. Calculating. Trying to find a version of reality that still worked. There wasn't one. Jared stepped forward, his voice rising. This doesn't make any sense, he said. We don't know how that got there. Someone must have... He stopped. Mid-sentence. Because there was nowhere for the accusation to go. The officer's gaze shifted between them. Calm. Steady. Unshaken. Ma'am, he said to Brianna, I'm going to need you to step over here. No, she said immediately. Wait, this isn't... Her voice cracked. Just slightly, but enough. Across the room, I could feel the shift ripple outward. The control they thought they had, the certainty, the timing, the outcome, it was gone. Replaced by confusion, by doubt, by the slow, creeping realization that something had gone wrong. Very wrong. Jared turned toward me then. For the first time that night, really looked at me. Not dismissive, not confident, uncertain. What did you do? He asked quietly. I met his gaze. Calm. Steady. Nothing in my expression gave him the answer he was searching for. I don't know what you're talking about, I said. And I didn't. Not in the way he meant. Because this wasn't something I had done to him. This was something he had set in motion himself. The officer stepped closer to Brianna, his tone firm now. Ma'am, I need you to come with me. Her breathing quickened, her composure unraveling completely. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising. This isn't mine. I didn't... She looked at Jared, desperate, waiting for him to fix it, to take control, to restore the version of reality they had built together. But Jared didn't move. He couldn't. Because for the first time, he didn't know how. The officer took her arm gently but firmly, guiding her away from the table. The second officer stepped closer to Jared. "Sir," he said, "we're going to need you to stay right here." Jared's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe, but not the one he thought." Patrick shifted beside me, his small hand still wrapped in mine. "Mom," he whispered. I looked down at him, softening just enough for him to see. "It's okay," I said. And this time, there was no doubt in my voice, because the moment had passed, the one they had been waiting for, the one they had built everything around, and it hadn't gone the way they planned. Across the room, Brianna's voice continued, louder now, more frantic, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to make sense of something that no longer made sense. Jared stood frozen, caught between control and collapse, and I sat there, still, composed, watching it all unfold. For the first time that night, they were the ones who didn't understand what was happening. And that was exactly where I needed them to be. No one spoke for a moment after they pulled the bag away. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, dense, filled with the kind of tension that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel deliberate. Brianna stood a few steps away now, her composure gone, her hands slightly raised like she didn't know what to do with them. "That's not mine," she said again, her voice thinner this time. "I didn't put that there." The officer didn't respond immediately. He watched her the way someone watches a story unfold, not reacting, just observing. Jared stepped forward again, trying to reclaim control. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice sharper now. "You're basing this on something that could have been planted by anyone." Anyone. The word lingered in the air. I felt his eyes shift toward me again, searching for a reaction, a weakness, something he could still use. But I didn't give him anything. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, because now it was my turn. "I think we should slow down," I said. My voice cut through the room, calm but clear. Both officers turned toward me. Jared stiffened. Brianna froze. And for the first time that night, the focus wasn't on what they had found. It was on what I was about to say. "What do you mean?" one of the officers asked. I folded my hands loosely in front of me. "I mean," I said, "this didn't start tonight." Jared's jaw tightened. "Melissa," he began. I didn't look at him. "I've been noticing things for weeks." I continued, my tone steady. Changes. Patterns that didn't make sense. The officer's attention sharpened. "What kind of patterns?" he asked. I met his gaze. "Financial ones," I said. That got Jared's attention. "That has nothing to do with this," he said quickly. "It has everything to do with this," I replied. The room shifted again. Not physically, but in focus, because now it wasn't just about what had been found. It was about why. I leaned forward slightly, my voice still calm, still controlled. "There have been transactions I couldn't account for," I said. "Transfers that didn't match the explanations I was given. Accounts that didn't align with our usual structure. I didn't overload it. I didn't need to. Just enough. Just enough to create a thread. And recently," I added, "those transactions started overlapping with a new name." I let the pause sit there. Then I looked at Brianna. Her face changed. Subtle, but undeniable. "What are you implying?" she asked. I didn't answer her. I looked back at the officer. "I'm saying," I said, "this isn't random." Jared stepped closer now, his voice rising. "This is completely irrelevant," he said. "You're trying to distract from what?" I asked, finally turning to him. For a second, he didn't respond, because there wasn't a clean answer. I held his gaze. "You want to talk about what's relevant," I said quietly. "Let's talk about timing." The officer glanced between us. "What about timing?" he asked. I shifted slightly in my chair, keeping my movements small, controlled. "The dinner," I said. "The conversation, the document you asked me to sign, Jared's expression flickered. And then this, I added, gesturing lightly toward the items now in the officer's possession. It's all connected. Brianna shook her head quickly. That's not true, she said. You're making assumptions. Am I? I asked. Her eyes darted away for a fraction of a second. That was enough. I turned back to the officer. I don't think this was about possession, I said. I think it was about placement. The word hung in the air. Placement. Jared exhaled sharply. This is insane, he said. You're turning this into something it's not. I tilted my head slightly. Then explain it, I said. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Nothing came out. Because explanations require consistency. And consistency is hard to maintain when the foundation is built on something else. I let the silence stretch again, then continued. I have records, I said. Emails, messages, conversations about restructuring assets, about risk, about exposure. The officer's attention sharpened further. Do you have access to those now? He asked. I nodded once. Yes. Brianna's breathing quickened. Jared's posture shifted. The control he had been holding onto slipping just enough to show what was underneath. This is going too far, he said. You can't just... I can... I said. Not louder. Just clearer. And that was enough. The room felt different now. Not tense. Defined. The lines had been drawn. The roles had shifted. I wasn't the one being questioned anymore. I was the one providing answers. The officer looked at me for a moment, measuring. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Do you have proof of what you're saying? I held his gaze. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself the smallest hint of certainty to show. Yes, I said. And it's more than you think? I didn't rush to prove anything. Silence stretched for a second after I said it. And I let them sit in it. Let them feel the shift before I moved. Then I reached for my phone. Not dramatically. Not like a reveal. Just another small, controlled motion. Jared watched me closely now. Every bit of his earlier confidence gone. Replaced by something tighter. Sharper. Melissa, he said. His voice low. Warning. Think carefully about what you're doing. I didn't look at him. I already have, I replied. I unlocked my phone, scrolling through a folder I had created weeks ago. Not because I knew exactly what I would find, but because I knew enough not to ignore what didn't make sense. Patterns don't lie. People do. The officer stepped closer. What do you have? He asked. I turned the screen slightly so he could see. Start with this, I said. A series of transaction records appeared. Clean. Organized. Dates aligned in a way that told a story without needing explanation. These are transfers from accounts Jared told me didn't exist, I said. They began about 6 weeks ago. The officer leaned in slightly. Scanning. And these? He asked. Linked accounts, I replied. Different names. Same access points. I didn't say Brianna's name yet. I didn't need to. He looked up. Do you have anything that connects these accounts to someone in this room? I tapped once more. A second screen appeared. Messages. Not vague. Not ambiguous. Clear enough to raise questions. Brianna's name was there. Jared's replies beneath it. Short. Direct. Coordinated. The officer's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Can you explain this? He asked, turning slightly toward them. Jared stepped forward. This doesn't prove anything, he said quickly. People talk about business all the time. Do they talk about moving assets before a legal separation? I asked quietly. He stopped. That was enough. The second officer moved closer now, his attention fully engaged. Legal separation, he repeated. I nodded once. That's what this was building toward, I said. Restructuring. Risk protection. Removing exposure. I let the words sit. Then I added, just as calmly, removing me. Brianna shook her head immediately. That's not what that means, she said. You're twisting it. Then explain it, the officer said. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because there are only so many ways to explain something when the context is already clear. Jared ran a hand through his hair, his movements sharper now. This is being taken out of context, he said. You don't understand how deals like this work. I understand exactly how they work. I replied. And I did. That was the problem. The officer straightened slightly, his tone shifting from neutral to official. Sir, he said, addressing Jared directly now. I'm going to need you to step over here. Jared didn't move. For what? He asked. To clarify your involvement. Involvement in what? He snapped. This is based on speculation. Combined with evidence, the officer said evenly. Jared laughed once, short and sharp. This is unbelievable, he muttered. But he stepped forward. Because at this point, he didn't have a choice. Brianna's composure had completely unraveled now. She looked between Jared and the officers, her breathing uneven, her earlier confidence gone. This isn't what it looks like, she said again. You don't understand. Then help us understand, the second officer said. She couldn't. Not without contradicting everything that had already been seen. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, but in options, in exits, in control. The officer glanced at his partner. A brief, silent exchange passing between them. Decision. It was subtle, but I saw it. Sir, the first officer said, his voice firm now. Based on what we've found and what's been presented, we're going to need you to come with us. Jared froze. What? He said. You're being detained while we continue this investigation. For a second, he just stared. Then the reaction came. This is insane, he said, his voice rising. You can't just... Yes, we can. The officer replied. He stepped forward. Jared instinctively took a step back. Control. Gone. Turn around. Please, the officer said. The words landed heavier than anything else that night. Jared looked at me then. Really looked at me. Not dismissive. Not confident. Not even angry. Just searching. Like he was trying to find the moment where everything had slipped away from him. He wouldn't find it. Because it hadn't happened in one moment. It had happened the second he assumed I wasn't paying attention. The handcuffs clicked into place. Sharp. Final. Brianna's voice broke behind him. Jared? But he didn't respond. He couldn't. The second officer moved toward her. Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us as well. No, she said immediately. I didn't do anything. Her voice cracked. Again, the same pattern. Denial. Confusion. Collapse. Patrick shifted beside me, his grip tightening. I covered his hand gently. It's okay, I whispered. And it was because the part they had planned so carefully had already passed. The officers began guiding them toward the door, their movements controlled, professional. Final? Jared tried one last time, turning slightly toward me. Melissa, he said. Just my name. Nothing else? No explanation. No defense. No strategy left. I met his gaze. And for the first time that night, I didn't need to say anything at all, because everything that needed to be said was already happening. The door opened, and this time, they were the ones being let out. The door closed, and the house went silent. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, the kind that lingers after something breaks. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I just stood there, my hand still resting lightly on the back of Patrick's chair, listening to the absence of everything that had filled the room just moments before. No voices, no tension, no performance, just stillness. Patrick looked up at me. Are they coming back? He asked quietly. I crouched beside him, smoothing a strand of hair away from his face. No, I said gently. Not tonight. He nodded slowly, absorbing it in the way children do, without fully understanding. but trusting the certainty in your voice. "Are we okay?" he asked again. I gave him a small smile. "We're more than okay." And this time, I felt it settle. Not as relief, as clarity. The night didn't feel like it had ended. It felt like something had been cut away. I stood up and looked around the dining room. The table was still set. Glasses half full. Plates barely touched. Everything frozen in the moment before everything shifted. It almost felt unreal, like it belonged to a different version of my life. I began clearing the table slowly, one item at a time. Not because it needed to be done right then, but because the rhythm helped me think. Because thinking was what mattered now. Not reacting. Not processing what had happened. But deciding what came next. Later that night, after Patrick had gone to bed, the house felt different. Quieter, but not empty. Clear. I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open. The soft glow of the screen illuminating the room. Documents spread across the screen, accounts. Structures, ownership records. Things I had set up long before tonight. Not out of fear, out of instinct. Jared had always believed he understood how everything worked. That he was in control. That the foundation of our life together was something he could reshape whenever he needed to. But he had never really looked closely. If he had, he would have seen it. The way everything important had been structured. Carefully. Deliberately. Not hidden. Just protected. The house. The primary accounts. The investments. All tied to systems he didn't fully control. He thought he was positioning himself for leverage. In reality, he had been standing outside it the entire time. I closed the laptop slowly. The realization settling in fully. He hadn't lost everything tonight. He had never actually had it. The next morning came quietly. Sunlight filtered through the windows. Soft and steady. Like the world had decided to move forward without asking permission. I made breakfast the way I always did. Simple. Familiar. Grounding. Patrick sat across from me. More relaxed than the night before, though still watching me carefully. Like he was trying to understand how everything had changed. "Do I still go to school today?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes, everything stays the same for you." That mattered. More than anything else. Because whatever had shifted in my life, his world needed to stay steady. After he left, I made the call. My lawyer answered on the second ring. "I need to start the process," I said. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just a decision. We spoke briefly, steps. Timing. Immediate protections. I listened. Asked what needed to be asked. And confirmed what needed to be done. By the time I ended the call, everything was already in motion. There was no turning back. Not that I wanted to. The weeks that followed didn't feel chaotic. They felt precise. Controlled. Like each step led cleanly into the next. Court dates were set. Documents filed. Statements recorded. Jared's situation unfolded exactly the way it was always going to once the truth surfaced. I didn't follow it closely. I didn't need to, because it wasn't my focus anymore. My focus was here. Forward. Months later. I sat in a courtroom. The air cool and still. The quiet murmur of legal voices filling the space. Patrick sat beside me, his feet barely touching the floor. His presence steady. Calm. The judge reviewed the final details. The process now reduced to its formal conclusion. Custody. It wasn't a question anymore. Not after everything that had come to light. Full custody is granted. The judge said. Simple. Direct. Final. I felt Patrick's hand slip into mine. I squeezed it gently. And just like that, it was done. Outside the courthouse. The air felt different. Lighter. Not because something had been taken away. Because something had been settled. Patrick looked up at me as we walked toward the car. "Does this mean it's over?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment. Then I nodded. "Yes," I said. "It does." And it did. Not in the sense that everything disappeared, but in the sense that it no longer held any power. That part of my life, the confusion, The tension, the constant need to question what was real, was gone. Not because it had been destroyed, because I had stepped out of it. I opened the car door for him, watching as he climbed in. His movements easy, unburdened, safe. That was the word that stayed with me. Not victory, not revenge. Safety. I closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side, pausing for just a second before getting in. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing behind me pulling me back. No uncertainty, no hidden layers, no waiting for something to happen. Just clarity, and the quiet understanding that I hadn't just made it through something. I had taken control of it. Completely. And I wasn't giving that up again. The morning felt different in a way I couldn't explain at first. Not louder. Not brighter. Just lighter. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, stretching slowly as the day began. And for the first time in months, I didn't wake up with that quiet tension sitting in my chest. The kind that makes you question what's real before your feet even touch the ground. I poured coffee into my mug and leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise in soft curls. There was no urgency, no weight pressing down on what the day might bring. Just stillness. And something else. Clarity. Patrick walked in a moment later, rubbing his eyes, his hair slightly messy in the way it always was in the mornings. He looked at me, then smiled, small, natural, unguarded. "Can I have pancakes?" he asked. I smiled back. "Of course you can." That simple, that normal, and it hit me then, not all at once, but in a quiet, steady way. This was what I had been fighting for. Not the argument, not the confrontation, not even the outcome. This, the ability to stand in my own space without questioning it, to make decisions without second-guessing who might be working against me, to breathe without feeling like something was about to shift underneath me. I moved around the kitchen, gathering what I needed, letting the familiar rhythm of small actions settle into place. Patrick sat at the table, swinging his legs slightly, completely at ease. Safe. That word stayed with me. Because safety isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's quiet. It's ordinary. And after everything that had happened, it meant everything. I set the plate down in front of him, and he grinned before digging in, focused entirely on something as simple as breakfast. I watched him for a moment, letting that image stay. Because that night, the dinner, the trap, the lies, it could have taken this away. That was the part they didn't understand. They thought this was about money, about control, about winning. But they were wrong. It was about this. And they were willing to destroy it. That's why they lost. Not because I was smarter, not because I was stronger, but because I saw what they were willing to risk, and I wasn't willing to play the same game. I turned back to the counter, resting my hands lightly against the surface, letting the thoughts settle fully. I didn't win by exposing them. I didn't win by watching everything collapse around them. I won the moment I stopped letting them define the rules. The moment I stepped back and saw everything clearly. The moment I realized that being quiet didn't mean being unaware. That trusting someone didn't mean losing yourself. And that power doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Patrick looked up at me suddenly. "Mom," he said. "Yeah. Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I hadn't needed to say it out loud before. I thought about it for a second. Not about the past. Not about what had happened. Just about right now. And I nodded. "Yeah," I said softly. "I am," he smiled, satisfied, and went back to his pancakes like that was all he needed. Maybe it was. I picked up my coffee again, taking a slow sip, my eyes drifting toward the window. The world outside looked exactly the same. Nothing had changed out there, but everything had changed here. Inside me. Inside this space. Inside the way I saw things now. They thought I was easy to break. Because I stayed quiet. Because I didn't react the way they expected. Because I didn't fight them on their terms. What they didn't understand was that I was watching, listening, learning, and waiting, not for them to make a mistake, but for the moment when I didn't need to play along anymore. And when that moment came, I didn't hesitate. I didn't panic. I didn't ask for permission. I just stepped out of the trap they built and let them fall into it instead. I set the cup down gently, the sound soft against the counter. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't always come with warning. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in conversations, in small changes, in things that don't quite feel right but are easy to ignore. And if you've ever been in that position where something feels off, but you can't prove it yet, I want you to trust that feeling. Because more often than not, it's telling you the truth before you're ready to hear it. Have you ever had a moment like that? When you realized something wasn't what it seemed, but no one else saw it yet? If you have, I'd really like to hear your story. Share it in the comments. And if stories like this remind you that you're not alone, that what you feel matters, then stay here. There's more to come. Because sometimes, the person they think is the weakest in the room is the one who's already won. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.